The Winter Contract. Chapter 1. The Inconvenience of Weather. The snow began falling somewhere beyond Newark, light at first, a delicate sifting of white across the frozen rutted road. By the time the mail coach laboured up the last rise before the spotted hare, it was coming down with the determined ferocity that spoke of a true blizzard settling in for the duration. Miss Charlotte Parrish, lately of London and formerly of a great many places she preferred not to think about, watched the flakes accumulate on the window glass with a feeling that sat uneasily between resignation and something very like despair. She had calculated the journey to her brother's vicarage in Yorkshire with the same precision she had applied to every undertaking since her husband's death 3 years past. 4 days, properly managed. 2 changes of coach. A night at a reputable inn in Stamford, another at York. Simple, manageable, entirely within her control. The weather, it appeared, had not consulted her calculations. "We're stopping, ma'am." The woman across from her, a milliner's assistant bound for Doncaster, chatty and kind-eyed, peered past Charlotte's shoulder at the white world beyond. "Lord, just look at it. We'll be lucky to get anywhere tonight." The coach lurched and swayed as the driver fought the horses toward the welcoming lights of the inn. Through the swirling snow, Charlotte could make out a substantial stone building, its windows glowing amber against the gathering dark. The Spotted Hare, if she remembered the route correctly, was the last decent inn before the road wound up into the moors. After this, only isolated posting houses and the occasional farmstead. The door opened before the coach had fully stopped, a stout landlord in a leather apron wading through the drifts with a lantern held high. "Inside, quickly," he called, reaching for the door handle. "We'll have your things brought in. No sense freezing for the sake of ceremony." Charlotte gathered her reticule and descended, the cold catching at her breath and the snow immediately finding its way beneath the collar of her serviceable wool cloak. The milliner's assistant hurried past her toward the door, and Charlotte followed, her half-boots already soaked through by the time she crossed the threshold. The inn's common room was a study in cheerful chaos. A fire roared in the great stone hearth, sending shadows leaping across the low ceiling. Travellers crowded every available surface. A family with small children huddled on a settle near the fire, a pair of commercial travellers arguing with the potboy over luggage, several other passengers from the mail coach pressing toward the warmth with varying degrees of complaint. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and wet wool. Charlotte stood just inside the door, allowing herself a moment to simply breathe and take stock. She was 32 years old, possessed of a small but adequate income, and accountable to no one. These facts, hard-won, were her armour. She would not panic because of a snowstorm. She would assess the situation, determine the best course of action, and proceed accordingly. "Your pardon, madam." The voice came from somewhere to her left, low and pleasant, with the particular ease of a man thoroughly accustomed to addressing strangers. Charlotte turned. He was tall, taller than most men, with the kind of lean, athletic build that suggested either a sporting life or a military background, though his clothing spoke of neither. His coat was beautifully cut, dark blue superfine that had cost more than Charlotte's entire wardrobe, and his linen was immaculate despite the journey. His face was the sort that artists liked to paint and mothers warned their daughters about. High cheekbones, a mouth that seemed perpetually on the verge of a smile, and eyes of a shade between grey and blue that held a warmth at odds with their cool colour. Those eyes were looking at her now with an expression of frank appreciation that Charlotte had not encountered in some years and did not particularly welcome. "You're blocking the door," he said, the smile breaking through. "Charmingly, I grant you, but the gentleman behind you appears to be turning an alarming shade of blue." Charlotte stepped aside without replying, moving deeper into the room. She had not, in truth, been blocking the door. There had been ample space for the blue-faced gentleman to pass. But something in the man's manner, that easy confidence, the assumption that his observation would be welcomed, made her want to put distance between them. She found a space against the wall near the fire and stood, allowing the warmth to seep into her chilled bones while she watched the landlord work his way through the crowd, placating, promising, and ultimately disappointing with the regularity of a man delivering unwelcome news. "No rooms," he was saying, spreading his hands in a gesture of helpless defeat. "I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but we've not a single bed left. The storm caught everyone on the road, and we've been filling up since midday. There's the stables, warm enough, and we'll bring blankets." A chorus of protest rose from the newly arrived passengers. The commercial travellers were particularly vocal, waving their arms and appealing to reason, to custom, to the basic laws of hospitality. The landlord bore it with the patience of long experience, his expression apologetic but immovable. Charlotte felt her carefully constructed plans crumbling around her. The stables. She had slept in worse places, God knew, in the years before her marriage and in the difficult months after. But she had promised herself, when she finally claimed her independence, that she would never again be at the mercy of circumstance. A lie, of course. One was always at the mercy of circumstance, but she had worked hard to build the illusion of control. "Madam." She looked up to find the tall man had materialized at her elbow, his expression now entirely serious. "I beg your pardon for the intrusion," he said, and this time there was nothing of flirtation in his voice, "but I overheard. That is, I observed that you are travelling alone, and I find myself in a position to offer assistance if you would permit it." Charlotte regarded him steadily. "What sort of assistance?" He hesitated, and for the first time something like uncertainty flickered across his features. "I have secured the last private parlour and the last bedchamber. The landlord is an acquaintance. I travel this road frequently, and he has reserved them for me against all comers. They are more than I require. The parlour has a settle, and I would be happy to, that is, if you would accept the use of the bedchamber while I make do with the settle, I would consider it a great kindness done to me, rather than the reverse." It was so precisely the opposite of what she had expected that Charlotte found herself momentarily without words. She had anticipated flirtation, or at the very least the sort of calculated gallantry that expected some return. This was something else entirely, offered with a kind of awkward sincerity that sat oddly on those handsome features. "Why?" she asked. He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Why would you offer such a thing to a stranger?" The question seemed to genuinely puzzle him. He considered it for a moment, his head tilted slightly. "Because you require it, and I am in a position to supply it. Is that not reason enough?" "No," Charlotte said flatly. "It is not." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming it entirely. The practiced gallantry fell away, replaced by something more genuine and considerably more appealing. "You are not an easy woman to impress, I collect." "I am not an easy woman to fool. There is a difference." "Indeed there is." He studied her with renewed interest. "Very well then. The truth. I have spent the past 3 weeks at my sister's estate in Lincolnshire, playing the role of devoted uncle to 5 children under the age of 10. It has been—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Exhausting. Delightful, but exhausting. I was looking forward to the solitude of my rooms tonight, to sitting before my own fire with a book and a bottle of the landlord's excellent brandy, and not speaking to another soul until morning. And yet here you are, speaking to me. Here I am." He shrugged, a graceful lift of broad shoulders. "The presence of a woman alone and in distress is not something I can ignore, whatever my personal preferences. It's the way I was raised. If that makes me foolish in your eyes, so be it. The offer stands." Charlotte considered him. The story had the ring of truth, and there was something in his manner, a directness, a lack of artifice, that disarmed her suspicions. Still, she had not survived this long by trusting handsome strangers. "If I accept," she said slowly, "what will the other travellers think?" His eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon?" You are a man, alone, offering a private chamber to a woman, alone. What construction will be placed upon that? He opened his mouth, closed it, and for the first time appeared genuinely taken aback. I had not considered, that is, I assumed. He stopped, ran a hand through his dark hair, and laughed. You see, this is what comes of 5 children. One forgets how the world works. You are quite right, of course. The appearance would be problematic. Extremely. They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the common room swirling around them. Charlotte watched him think, watched the calculations move behind those grey-blue eyes, and felt the stirring of something she had not felt in a very long time. Curiosity. There is a solution, he said slowly, though I hesitate to offer it. At this point, I would hear any solution. Marriage. Charlotte stared at him. A temporary marriage, he amended quickly, holding up his hands. A sham, an engagement, rather. We announce that we are betrothed, travelling separately to avoid gossip, and reunited by chance at this inn. The landlord will confirm that we arrived separately. I'll speak to him, explain that we had a disagreement on the road, and you continued with the mail coach while I rode ahead. It will be all over the common room by morning, and no one will think twice about our sharing a parlour. You are suggesting that we pretend to be engaged. I am suggesting that we pretend to be engaged for the duration of the storm. A day, perhaps 2. When the road's clear, we go our separate ways, and no one is the wiser. Charlotte became aware that she was staring at him with her mouth slightly open. She closed it. That is the most absurd proposition I have ever heard. Is it more absurd than spending the night in the stables? More absurd than facing the speculation and gossip that will inevitably attach to a woman travelling alone who accepts a man's hospitality without the protection of a respectable connection? He shook his head. I offer you reputation, madam. The appearance of propriety, at least. What you do with it is your own affair. She should refuse. Every instinct, every hard-won lesson of the past decade told her to refuse. She had built her life on the principle of depending on no one, of owing nothing to any man. To accept this stranger's offer was to place herself in his debt, to invite exactly the kind of complication she had spent years avoiding. And yet, the stables would be cold, the stables would be public, with no privacy, no security, no lock on the door. The stables would strip away the last pretense of the respectable independence she had worked so hard to construct. A widow travelling alone was one thing. A widow bedding down with the horses was quite another. What would this entail? She asked, hating the question even as she asked it. He considered. We share the parlour tonight, with the door open if you prefer. I sleep on the settle, you take the bedchamber. Tomorrow, if the storm continues, we breakfast together, appear in the common room as a betrothed couple, and generally play our parts until the weather clears. When it does, we part company with expressions of regret and go our separate ways. No one need ever know. And your name? If we are to be engaged, I should at least know what to call you. He smiled, that genuine smile that had so transformed his face earlier. Julian. Julian Ashworth. And you. Charlotte hesitated, then offered her hand. Charlotte Parrish, Mrs. Charlotte Parrish. Mrs. Parrish. He took her hand, his grip warm and firm and brief. A pleasure to make your acquaintance, however extraordinary the circumstances. The pleasure is entirely theoretical at this point. His laugh was surprised out of him, genuine and warm. I like you, Mrs. Parrish. I think this sham engagement may prove more entertaining than I anticipated. I am not here for your entertainment, Mr. Ashworth. No, he agreed, his eyes dancing. I am beginning to understand that you are not here for anyone's entertainment but your own. Come, let me introduce you to the landlord as my intended, and then I shall leave you to your well-earned privacy. Chapter 2. The Geography of a Parlour. The parlor was small but well appointed, with a fire already blazing in the grate and 2 comfortable chairs drawn up before it. A settle stood against one wall, long enough for a tall man to stretch out if he bent his knees, and a door at the back led to the bedchamber Charlotte had been promised. It was, by any reasonable standard, luxurious compared to the stables. Charlotte stood in the centre of the room, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, and tried to remember the last time she had felt so thoroughly off balance. Julian Ashworth had vanished to speak with the landlord, leaving her with the assurance that all would be arranged. She had watched him cross the common room, noting the way other travellers stepped aside for him without seeming to realise they were doing so, the way the landlord's face had lit with recognition at his approach. He moved through the world with the ease of a man who had never known what it was to be overlooked, to be insignificant, to be at the mercy of others' whims. She knew the type. She had married one. The door opened, and he was there, shaking snow from his greatcoat and hanging it on a peg by the door. All arranged. The landlord remembers that we had a falling out at the last posting house. I was impossibly high-handed, apparently, and you refused to continue in my company. He is full of sympathy for your situation and has promised to spread the word of our reconciliation. By morning, we will be the most romantic story in the inn. I'm sure. Charlotte did not move from her position in the centre of the room. You seem to have given this considerable thought. I have a certain facility for improvisation. He crossed to the fire and held his hands to the flames. Also, I have 5 nieces and nephews. One learns to think on one's feet. Charlotte watched him, this handsome stranger who had so neatly inserted himself into her life. He was at ease here, in this small room, with the firelight playing over his features and the storm howling outside. He was at ease everywhere, she suspected. It was his natural habitat. I should change out of these wet things, she said, more to break the silence than from any real urgency. If you will excuse me. Of course. He gestured toward the bedchamber door. Take your time. I'll have the landlord send up some dinner. We can discuss the details of our engagement over roasted chicken. Charlotte retreated to the bedchamber and closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a long moment with her eyes shut. The room was small but clean, with a proper bed, a washstand, and a window through which she could see nothing but swirling white. She had been given a gift tonight, an unexpected reprieve from the cold and discomfort of the stables, and it had come wrapped in the person of a man whose very existence seemed designed to remind her of everything she had left behind. She had been beautiful once. Not in the way of the current fashion. She had never had the delicate features or the willowy figure that gentlemen admired, but in a way that had caught the attention of Gerald Parrish when she was 19 and desperate and convinced that marriage was her only escape. He had been handsome too, in his fashion, with the same easy confidence that Julian Ashworth wore so naturally. He had promised her the world, and for a little while she had believed him. She had learned, in the years that followed, that confidence and cruelty were not mutually exclusive. That a man who moved through the world with ease might expect his wife to move through it at his command. That beauty, in a husband's eyes, was a possession to be guarded and displayed and used as he saw fit. When Gerald died, a hunting accident, the sort of stupid, senseless death that seemed almost inevitable in retrospect, Charlotte had felt nothing but relief. She had mourned him properly, of course, for the sake of appearances, but in the privacy of her own mind she had celebrated. 3 years of freedom, 3 years of answering to no one, of making her own decisions, of building a life that was entirely her own. She was not about to surrender that freedom for a pair of grey-blue eyes and a charming smile. When she emerged from the bedchamber some 20 minutes later, changed into a dry gown of dark grey wool, and with her hair pinned up more securely, she found that a table had been set before the fire, and that Julian Ashworth was pouring 2 glasses of wine. I took the liberty of ordering, he said, gesturing to the covered dishes. I hope you don't mind. I find that administrative details, arranging meals, securing rooms, negotiating with landlords, are best handled before one sits down to relax. Charlotte took the seat he offered, accepting the glass of wine with a nod of thanks. You are very efficient. I am very practiced. There is a difference. She sipped the wine, good, better than she had expected from a coaching inn, and studied him over the rim of her glass. Tell me about this practice. What does a man like you do with his time when he is not rescuing widows from snowstorms? A man like me? He raised an eyebrow, but there was amusement in it rather than offence. I confess I am curious what category you have assigned me to. The category of men who have never wanted for anything, who have always had rooms reserved for them, and wine poured for them, and women smiling at them, who move through the world as if it were created for their convenience. He considered this, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. That is remarkably perceptive and remarkably unflattering. Am I to understand that you do not approve of such men? I have found them to be generally not worth the trouble of disapproval. He laughed, that surprised laugh she was beginning to recognize. You are extraordinary, Mrs. Parrish. Most women, in my experience, are at least slightly interested in flattering me. Most women, in your experience, are probably interested in a great many things that have nothing to do with you personally. True. He lifted his glass in acknowledgement, but they generally have the courtesy to pretend otherwise. I have never had much use for courtesy, if courtesy means pretending to be something I am not. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than she had intended. Julian's expression shifted, the amusement fading into something more complex. No, he said quietly. I don't imagine you have. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. Charlotte found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the shape of his hands as he carved the chicken, the way his attention drifted to the window whenever the wind gusted particularly hard, the small furrow between his brows that appeared when he was thinking. He was not what she had expected. That was the problem. He was supposed to be a type, easily categorized and dismissed, but he kept slipping out of the categories she tried to impose. The storm is getting worse, he said, stating the obvious. We may be here longer than a day. I had considered that possibility. And your plans, your family, will they worry? Charlotte hesitated. The question was reasonable, the sort of thing anyone might ask, but it touched on matters she did not discuss with strangers. My brother is expecting me in Yorkshire. He will assume the weather has delayed me. He is not the worrying sort. And your husband? Dead. The word came out flat, final, the way it always did. She had learned to deliver it like a blow, to end curiosity before it could begin. Julian's expression did not change, except that the warmth in his eyes deepened. I am sorry for your loss. Don't be. It was not a loss I mourned. She had not meant to say that. The words escaped before she could stop them, and she watched his face for the inevitable shift, the discomfort, the pity, the awkward attempt to change the subject. Instead, he simply nodded. Then I am sorry for the marriage that preceded it. Charlotte stared at him. That is a very unusual response. Is it? He shrugged. I have known enough unhappy marriages to understand that death is not always a tragedy for the survivor. My own parents... He stopped, shook his head. But that is a story for another time. Tell me about Yorkshire instead. What takes you there? It was so clearly a deliberate change of subject, so carefully offered to spare her further discussion of painful matters, that Charlotte felt something shift inside her. Not trust, exactly. She was too old and too wary for trust, but something that might, in time, become its foundation. My brother is the vicar in a small village near Ripon. He has invited me to stay for Christmas, and I have accepted. And you were looking forward to it? I was looking forward to the change of scene. London in winter is... oppressive. I know what you mean. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs toward the fire. I spend most of my time in London, by necessity rather than preference. The season, Parliament, the endless round of obligations. Sometimes I think I would trade it all for a small house in the country and the right to be left alone. Why don't you? He smiled, but there was something tired in it. Because I am not brave enough to disappoint everyone who expects me to be something else. The honesty of it startled her. She had expected evasion, charm, the easy deflection of a man who had spent his life learning to say nothing of consequence. Instead, he had given her truth, uncomfortable, revealing truth, and in doing so had made it impossible for her to maintain her defences. I understand that, she heard herself say, better than you might think. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment the small parlour seemed to contract around them, the fire's warmth pressing close, the storm outside reduced to a distant murmur. Charlotte became acutely aware of the space between them, of the fact that they were alone, of the dangerous intimacy of a winter night shared with a stranger. She looked away first. We should discuss the practicalities, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. If we are to maintain this fiction, we need to know something of each other, enough to answer questions, to seem plausible. Of course. He did not comment on her abrupt change of subject, merely reached for the wine and refilled both their glasses. What would you like to know? Where you live, for a start. Your family, your occupation, your reason for being on this road. The details that will satisfy curiosity if anyone asks. He nodded, settling more comfortably in his chair. I have a house in London, in Brook Street, and an estate in Hampshire that my younger brother manages for me. I am, officially, a gentleman of leisure, though I sit in the House of Lords when required. My father died 6 years ago, and I inherited his title. I have been visiting my sister, Lady Marchmont, at her husband's estate in Lincolnshire. I am unmarried, to the despair of my mother and the amusement of my friends. A lord. Charlotte's voice was flat. You might have mentioned that. Would it have made a difference? It would have confirmed my initial assessment. Which was, that you are exactly the sort of man I have spent my life learning to avoid. He did not take offence. If anything, he looked amused again, though the amusement was tempered with something like respect. And yet here you are, sharing my parlour, and my dinner, and my wine. What does that make you, Mrs. Parrish? It was a good question, and she did not have an answer. They spent the next hour exchanging the bare facts of their lives, enough to construct a plausible history, enough to answer the questions that might come. Charlotte told him about her childhood in Yorkshire, her marriage, her widowhood. She edited heavily, omitting the worst of Gerald's cruelties, the years of careful walking on eggshells, the relief that had been so profound, it felt like guilt. But she told him enough, and he listened without judgment, without the pity that would have made her retreat back into silence. In return, he told her about his family, the sister he adored, the brother who resented him, the mother who saw him only as a means to an end. He spoke of his father with a careful neutrality that suggested depths of feeling he did not wish to explore, and of his own life with a self-deprecating humour that revealed more than he probably intended. By the time the fire had burned low and the wine was finished, Charlotte realised that she had, against all reason and judgment, begun to like him. It was a dangerous realisation, and she tucked it away where it could do no harm. I should retire, she said, rising. It has been a long day. Of course. He stood as well, moving to the settle and beginning to arrange the cushions. I'll have the landlord bring up breakfast in the morning. 8 o'clock. We should make an appearance in the common room before the other travellers disperse. 8 o'clock. She paused at the door to the bedchamber, one hand on the latch. Mr. Ashworth, Julian, thank you for all of this. He looked up from his work, and in the low firelight his expression was impossible to read. "You are welcome, Mrs. Parrish. Sleep well." She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, listening to the sounds of him settling on the settle, the creak of wood, the soft sigh of a man making himself comfortable. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, and Charlotte Parrish, who had sworn never to depend on anyone again, found herself profoundly grateful for the presence of a stranger on the other side of the door. Chapter 3. The Art of Pretending. They woke to a world transformed. Charlotte stood at the bedchamber window, looking out at a landscape so thoroughly buried that she could not tell where the inn yard ended and the road began. The snow had drifted halfway up the window, and more was falling, gentler now but persistent, a soft white curtain that showed no signs of lifting. When she emerged, dressed and composed, she found Julian already awake, the settle restored to its proper place, and a maid just setting a tray on the table before the fire. "Good morning," he said, rising. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough." She took the seat he offered, accepting the cup of chocolate the maid poured with a murmur of thanks. When the girl had gone, she looked at him across the table. "The storm continues." "It does. I've spoken to the landlord, who speaks to the ostlers, who speak to God, apparently. The roads are impassable in both directions. We are here for the duration." Charlotte absorbed this without visible reaction. "How long?" He won't hazard a guess. A day, perhaps 2, perhaps longer. The last storm of this severity, he says, trapped a coach for nearly a week. A week. Charlotte kept her expression neutral, but something shifted inside her. A flutter of something that might have been alarm, or might have been something else entirely. A week in this small parlor, with this man, playing at an engagement that grew more complicated with every hour. "I see. Do you?" He was watching her with those grey-blue eyes, seeing more than she wanted him to see. "Because if you would prefer to abandon the fiction, if you would rather face the speculation of the other travellers than continue this, I will understand. We can simply be 2 strangers sharing a parlour and let the gossips make what they will." "And face the consequences of that for the rest of my life? No, thank you. I have worked too hard for my reputation to surrender it to a snowstorm." "Then we continue. We continue." They breakfasted in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and then, as planned, descended together to the common room. The effect was immediate, and exactly as Julian had predicted. Heads turned, eyebrows rose, and a murmur of speculation rippled through the crowded space. Charlotte felt the weight of dozens of curious gazes and forced herself to smile, to lean slightly toward Julian as they walked, to play the part of a woman newly reconciled with her betrothed. "The prodigal couple," Julian murmured, his lips barely moving. "Smile as if you mean it, my dear. The milliner's assistant is watching with particular interest." Charlotte smiled, and it was not entirely feigned. "You seem to enjoy this." "I am an actor manqué. All the best lords are." He guided her to a table near the fire, settling her with a solicitousness that would have done credit to a devoted lover. "Now, shall we order tea and allow ourselves to be observed? It is the least we can do for an audience that has clearly been starved of entertainment." They spent the morning in the common room, accepting the curious glances and the occasional bold question with practiced ease. Charlotte was surprised to find that the role came naturally to her. The soft glances, the touches on Julian's arm, the way she leaned toward him when he spoke. It was like putting on a familiar garment, one she had worn in the early days of her marriage, before she had learned what that marriage truly was. But this was different. This was play, not reality. And Julian, for all his charm, was not Gerald. By midday, the story of their reconciliation had spread through the inn like wildfire, and Charlotte found herself the recipient of knowing smiles and whispered congratulations. The milliner's assistant, whose name was Mary, cornered her near the stairs with a look of eager sympathy. "I am so happy for you, ma'am," she said, her round face alight with romantic fervour. "To be reunited like this, against all odds, it's like something from a novel." "Indeed." Charlotte smiled, the practiced smile she had worn all morning. "Life is strange sometimes. And your young man is so handsome and so devoted. I saw the way he looked at you during breakfast, as if you were the only woman in the room." Charlotte felt something twist in her chest, something that was not entirely comfortable. "He is very attentive." "You are fortunate, ma'am. Truly fortunate." Mary sighed, a sound of pure romantic longing. "I hope one day to find a love like that." Charlotte murmured something appropriate and made her escape, but the girl's words followed her up the stairs and into the parlor, where Julian was waiting with a book and a glass of something that steamed invitingly. "Success?" he asked, looking up. "Complete and total. We are the most romantic story in Yorkshire." "Excellent." He set aside his book and rose, crossing to pour her a glass of the steaming liquid. "Mulled wine. The landlord's wife makes it with some secret combination of spices that I have never been able to replicate. It will warm you." Charlotte accepted the glass, wrapping her cold hands around its warmth, and stood at the window looking out at the snow. "Mary, the milliner's assistant, thinks we are the model of a devoted couple. She envies me." "Most women would envy you, I think, at least in the abstract." He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but not so close as to crowd. The handsome lord, the dramatic reconciliation, the snowbound inn. It has all the elements of a romantic tale. "Except that it is not real." "No." His voice was soft, thoughtful. "It is not." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the snow fall. Charlotte was acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the solid warmth of him, of the way her heart had begun to beat in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. "What will you do," she asked, "when this is over? When the road's clear, and we go our separate ways?" "Return to London, I suppose. Face my mother's disappointment that I have not produced an heiress from somewhere, attend the usual round of parties, and pretend that I am not bored to death by all of it." He shrugged. "And you?" "Yorkshire. My brother's vicarage. A quiet Christmas with a man who has never understood me, and a sister-in-law who does not try." She smiled, but there was no humour in it. "We will both be pretending, in our different ways. At least your pretense serves a purpose. Mine is merely habit." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw for the first time the weariness beneath the charm, the loneliness beneath the ease. He was not so different from her, she realized. They were both playing roles, both hiding behind masks, both desperately alone in the middle of a crowd. "Julian," she began, but whatever she might have said was lost in a knock at the door. It was the landlord, come to inform them that dinner would be served in the common room that evening, a communal meal for all the stranded travellers. Would they be attending? Julian looked at Charlotte, a question in his eyes. "We would be delighted," she said, before she could think better of it. The common room that evening was transformed. Treasures had been brought from cellars and cupboards, candles enough to banish every shadow, bottles of wine that had been aging for decades, dishes that the landlord's wife had been saving for a special occasion. The storm, it seemed, had become an excuse for celebration, a brief respite from the ordinary constraints of life. Charlotte sat beside Julian at the long table that had been created by pushing together every surface in the room, and watched the strange community that had formed among the stranded travellers. The commercial travellers had abandoned their complaints and were telling stories of the road. The family with small children had been adopted by a pair of elderly spinsters who seemed to have forgotten they disapproved of children. Mary the milliner's assistant was deep in conversation with a young farmer who had been trapped on his way to market, their heads bent together over cups of mulled wine. And beside her, Julian Ashworth was playing his role to perfection. He was attentive without being smothering, charming without being false. He drew her into conversations, told stories that made her laugh, touched her hand at just the right moments to seem devoted without being improper. He was, she realized, very good at this, at making people feel seen, at creating warmth where none had existed before. But it was not, she thought, entirely an act. When his hand covered hers on the table, responding to some comment from across the room about their happy reunion, his fingers were warm and solid and real. When he looked at her with those grey-blue eyes, there was something in them that she had not seen before, something that made her breath catch and her heart stutter. She was in trouble. The thought came to her clearly, calmly, as if from a great distance. She was in trouble, and she had known it since that first moment in the parlor, since he had offered her his rooms with no expectation of return, since he had looked at her and seen not a widow to be pitied, but a woman to be respected. She was in danger of caring for him. After dinner, when the music began, someone had produced a fiddle, and the farmer had turned out to have a fine tenor voice. Julian drew her onto the makeshift dance floor. "One dance," he said, his hand at her waist. "For appearances." "Of course." She placed her hand on his shoulder, felt the warmth of him through the fine cloth of his coat. "For appearances." They moved together through the steps of a country dance, their bodies finding the rhythm without conscious thought. Around them, the other dancers laughed and spun, but Charlotte was aware of nothing but Julian, the pressure of his hand on her waist, the way his eyes never left her face, the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth. "You are very good at this," she said, as they came together in the pattern of the dance. "I have had a great deal of practice." "At dancing, or at pretending?" His eyes met hers, and something flickered in their depths. "At both, at neither, I am not sure anymore." The dance separated them, brought them back together. When he took her hand again, his fingers tightened slightly, a brief pressure that said more than words could. "Charlotte." His voice was low, meant only for her. "When this is over, when the road's clear, I do not want to say goodbye." She should have laughed. She should have made a light remark, turned it aside with the ease of long practice. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth of it in his face. "Julian, I know." He shook his head, a small, rueful movement. "I know. This is not real. We are playing parts, but somewhere in the playing, I have lost the ability to tell where the part ends, and I begin. Or perhaps—" He stopped, drew a breath. "Perhaps I have stopped wanting to tell." The music ended. Around them, the other dancers applauded, called for another tune. Charlotte stood frozen in the circle of Julian's arms, her heart pounding, her mind a chaos of conflicting thoughts. "I need air," she heard herself say, "just for a moment." She was at the door before he could respond, slipping out into the freezing night, the cold hitting her like a physical blow. The snow had stopped finally, and the sky was clearing, stars emerging in the gaps between clouds. She stood in the inn-yard, breathing in the cold, trying to calm the tumult inside her. She heard his footsteps in the snow behind her, knew he had followed before he spoke. "Charlotte, I'm sorry. I should not have—" "Don't." She turned to face him, and in the starlight his face was all shadows and silver. "Don't apologize for telling the truth. It is too rare a thing." "Then what do you want me to say?" It was the right question, and she did not have an answer. She wanted him to say nothing. She wanted him to say everything. She wanted him to kiss her, and she wanted him to walk away, and she wanted the storm to continue forever so that she would never have to decide. Instead, she said the only thing that mattered. "I don't know what is real anymore. I don't know if I am playing a part or if the part has become real or if there was never a part at all. I only know that when I am with you, I feel—" She stopped, searched for the word. Alive. I feel alive in a way I have not felt in years. He moved toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away. She did not move. Charlotte. His voice was rough, tender, wondering. May I kiss you? Not for appearances. Not for the sake of the fiction. For us. For whatever this is. She should say no. She should protect herself, guard her heart, remember everything she had learned about the danger of trusting men. But she was tired of being careful, tired of being alone, tired of the walls she had built so carefully around herself. Yes, she whispered. Yes. His lips were warm against the cold of her skin, gentle at first, questioning. When she did not pull away, when her hands came up to frame his face, the kiss deepened, became something more, something that spoke of loneliness and longing and the terrifying possibility of hope. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the stars seemed brighter overhead and the snow less cold beneath their feet. We should go back inside, Charlotte murmured, though she made no move to leave the circle of his arms. In a moment. He pressed his forehead to hers, his breath warm on her lips. In just a moment. Above them, the clouds continued to clear, and somewhere in the distance, the first hint of a thaw began. Chapter 4. The Thaw. They woke to the sound of dripping. Charlotte lay in the bedchamber, listening to the steady rhythm of water falling from the eaves, and felt her heart contract with something that was not quite relief. The storm was ending. The roads would clear. The time for pretense was drawing to a close. She had not slept well. The memory of that kiss in the snowbound yard had played through her dreams, merging with older memories, with fears and hopes, and the terrifying possibility of a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. She was 32 years old, a widow with a small independence and a carefully constructed life. She was not supposed to fall in love with handsome lords in snowbound inns, but she was afraid now that she had done exactly that. When she emerged from the bedchamber, she found Julian already dressed, standing at the window with his back to her. The parlor was bright with reflected light from the snow, and the sound of dripping was louder here, a constant reminder that the world was moving on. The thaw has begun, he said, without turning. The landlord says the road should be passable by midday. Charlotte stood in the doorway, watching the set of his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped behind his back. I see. He turned then, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. There was no charm there now, no easy smile, nothing but a raw vulnerability that transformed his handsome features into something new and startlingly real. I've been standing here for an hour, he said, trying to decide what to say to you, trying to find the words that will make you understand that last night was not, that I am not. He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that was utterly unlike his usual composure. I am not good at this, at saying what I mean. I have spent my entire life learning to say what is expected, what is safe, what will smooth the way and avoid conflict. And now, when it matters most, I find that I have no idea how to tell you the truth. Charlotte moved into the room, crossing to stand before him. Then stop trying to find the perfect words. Just tell me. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes shifted. A decision made, a risk accepted. I love you. The words hung in the air between them, simple and terrifying. I know it is too soon. I know we have known each other only days. I know that everything about this situation is absurd and improbable and probably doomed. But I have spent 38 years moving through the world without ever feeling that I truly belonged anywhere, with anyone. And in 2 days, you have made me feel more at home than I have in my entire life. Charlotte felt tears prick at her eyes, felt the walls she had built so carefully begin to crack. Julian. You don't have to say it back. He caught her hands in his grip warm and urgent. I don't expect. I have no right to expect, but I needed you to know. Before the road's clear, before we go our separate ways, I needed you to know that for me, this was never just a pretense. Charlotte looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his fine, long fingers and her smaller, work-roughened ones. She thought about Gerald, about the years of careful walking on eggshells, about the relief she had felt when he died. She thought about the life she had built since then, the small satisfactions of independence, the safety of being accountable to no one. And she thought about Julian, about his kindness to a stranger, his respect for her boundaries, his willingness to be vulnerable. About the way he looked at her as if she were precious, as if she mattered, as if she were not merely a convenience or a possession, but a person in her own right. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to trust. I don't know how to let someone in. My marriage taught me that love is a cage, that dependence is danger, that the only safety is in solitude. I know. His voice was gentle, understanding. I know. But I also know that I have not felt alive in years, that I have been going through the motions, building my walls higher and higher, until I forgot what it felt like to truly connect with another person. She looked up at him, let him see the fear and the hope and the desperate longing that she had hidden for so long. And I know that with you, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I want to try. His breath caught. Charlotte. I'm not saying I love you. I'm not sure I know what love is anymore, or whether I am capable of it. But I am saying that I want to find out, that I am willing to try, that when the road's clear, I do not want to say goodbye. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile and infinitely valuable. She felt his heart beating against her cheek, felt the strength of his arms around her, felt the warmth of him seeping into the cold places she had carried for so long. Then don't, he murmured into her hair. Don't say goodbye. Come with me to London, or let me come with you to Yorkshire, or meet me somewhere in between. Give me time to prove that I am not your husband, that I will never be your husband, that I want only to be the man who makes you feel alive. She pulled back just enough to look at him, to search his face for any hint of the charm she had learned to distrust. She found only sincerity, only hope, only the same terrifying vulnerability she felt in her own heart. I have conditions, she said. He smiled, that genuine smile that had first made her lower her defenses. I would expect nothing less. First, I will not be controlled. I have had enough of that to last a lifetime. If we are to be together, it must be as equals, partners in truth, not just in name. Agreed. Second, I will not be rushed. I need time to learn to trust, to learn to love, to learn to be vulnerable again. You must be patient with me. I will be as patient as you need, for as long as you need. And third, she hesitated, then plunged ahead. Third, you must promise me that if it doesn't work, if I cannot overcome my fears, if we discover that we are not suited after all, you will let me go. Without anger, without recrimination, without making me feel that I have failed. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him absorb the weight of what she was asking. Then he nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I promise, he said. It will break my heart, but I promise. She believed him. That was the astonishing thing. She believed him. Not because he was charming, not because he said the right words, but because she had seen him when he was not trying to be charming, had heard him speak truth when it would have been easier to lie, had watched him choose vulnerability over pretense again and again. Then yes, she said, and felt the words unlock something inside her. Yes, I will try. He kissed her then, gently, reverently, as if she were a gift he had not expected to receive. and she kissed him back, not as a role, not as a pretense, but as herself, Charlotte Parrish, widow, survivor, woman who had forgotten how to hope and was learning, slowly, to remember. The dripping continued outside, the sound of snow melting, of roads clearing, of the world returning to its ordinary rhythms. But in the small parlor of the Spotted Hare, something new was beginning, something that had nothing to do with storms or pretense or the careful calculations of self-protection. Something that might, with time and patience and courage, become love. They left the inn together that afternoon when the road was declared passable. The landlord waved them off with a knowing smile, and Mary the milliner's assistant pressed a small packet of biscuits into Charlotte's hands with whispered wishes for her happiness. Julian had arranged for a post-chaise to take them as far as York, where they would part company temporarily, he to London to settle his affairs, she to her brother's vicarage to explain that her plans had changed, that she would not be staying indefinitely, that she had met someone and was giving herself permission to hope. "You will write to me?" he asked as they stood beside the chaise in the inn-yard. "Every day." She smiled up at him, feeling the strangeness of it. This new thing, this fragile thing, this possibility that had opened like a flower in the snow. "And you will do the same?" "Every day." He kissed her hand, a gesture so formal and so tender that it made her heart ache. "Until we are together again. And then we will see, together." He helped her into the chaise, tucked a rug around her knees with a solicitude that spoke of genuine care rather than mere politeness. "No more pretense, Charlotte, just us." The chaise lurched into motion, and she watched him through the window until the curve of the road hid him from view. Then she settled back against the squabs, the packet of biscuits warm in her hands, and allowed herself to think about the future. It was terrifying, this unknown territory. It was also, she realized, exhilarating. For the first time in years, she did not know what would happen next. For the first time in years, she was willing to find out. The snow continued to melt, and the road stretched ahead, and Charlotte Parrish, who had spent so long building walls, felt them crumbling around her, felt the sunlight of possibility warming places that had been cold for far too long. She thought of Julian's face as he had said goodbye, the hope and fear and love that had been written there so plainly. She thought of his promises, his patience, his willingness to let her set the pace. She thought of the kiss in the snowbound yard and the conversation that morning and the terrifying, wonderful truth that she was not alone anymore. The winter contract had ended with the thaw, but something else, something real, was just beginning. 3 months later, in a small church in Hampshire, Charlotte Parrish became Charlotte Ashworth. The witnesses were her brother, who had finally come to understand her, and Julian's sister, who had welcomed her with open arms. The service was small, the celebration quiet, and the groom cried when he saw his bride walking toward him. "I told you I would be patient," he whispered, as they stood together at the altar. "I did not say I would not be emotional." She laughed, the sound bright and free in the ancient space. "I would not have you any other way." Outside, the first flowers of spring were pushing through the thawing ground, and the world was full of promise. The end. As this story draws to its final breath, I want to thank you, truly, for walking every step of this journey, for lingering in its silences, for feeling its heartache, and for believing, even in its darkest moments, that love might yet prevail. If this tale has stirred something deep within you, if it has reminded you of the quiet power of devotion, resilience, and hope, then I invite you to stay. Subscribe and step with us into many more worlds where love is tested, hearts are broken, and, always, something beautiful endures. Your next story is already waiting.